It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to our Access Breakfast. I think you will find it very, very interesting and compelling. I'm Sheldon Anderson, the chair of the Beacon Council, and I'm just delighted to have all of you with us on this bright, sunny Miami, London day. The Beacon Council is Miami's official economic development organization. And as you know, we're charged with bringing job-generating opportunities to Miami, as well as assisting companies expand here. This has been a most exciting 3 months for both me and Larry. We both started our journeys with the Beacon Council, me as chair and he as president and CEO. And I'm looking forward to a very exciting and successful year. Together with our mayor, Carlos Jimenez, and the Board of Commissioners, we work to make sure that companies believe that we are the ideal location for their businesses to both create jobs and to expand existing business in Miami-Dade County. But today, I'm really excited about our Access Breakfast, and I think most of you know that the Access event is a public forum for conversations that affect our local economy. Today, we partner with the British Consul General of Miami to discuss a new transatlantic trade and investment partnership with the UK. The United Kingdom has championed a trade deal between the European Union and the United States to the launch of the negotiations for the EU-US Transatlantic Partnership has the potential to be the largest bilateral trade agreement in the world, bringing economic benefits in terms of growth and jobs to both sides of the Atlantic. It could add more than $130 billion to the U.S. economy. Our guest speaker today is certainly no stranger to the Beacon Council. Every event that I go to within the city, he's right there with us. And of course, I'm referring to the British Consul General, the Honorable Kevin McGurgan. Consul General took up this appointment as Consul General of Miami in December of 2009. He was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. He joined the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 1990 when he was about 18 years old. He came to Florida from southern Afghanistan, where he spent 2008 and 2009 as the deputy head of the NATO Provincial Reconstruction Team in Helmand Province. He worked there with Afghan political and tribal leaders to improve security and prepare the ground for the arrival of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Brigade of the U.S. Marines in the spring of 2009. He was made an officer of the British Empire for his work in the 2010 Queen's Birthday Honors, and I know we all remember that spectacle. This is his second posting in the United States. From 1997 to 2000, he worked at the United Nations in New York on multilateral sanction regimes, negotiating and implementing sanctions regimes in the Middle East, Asia, and the diamond and arms embargoes in Africa. Please help me welcome the British Consul General, the Honorable Kevin McGurgan.
Okay, well, Sheldon and Larry, colleagues from the Beacon Council, and everybody who's made out here on this very, very British day, thank you all so much for coming along this morning. Just a couple of words of thanks, first of all, to Sheldon and the Beacon Council. You know, we're very much in the same game on the other side of the pond as well, economic development. And one of the things that we get high ratings from those companies who come here to do business, to look for opportunity, is the work you do with investors here. And last year we had a good turnout. You had BioEarth, you had Skyscanner, and of course you had, most importantly, Cable and Wireless moving significant operations to Coral Gables. So congratulations to you and to everybody in Miami for that sort of investment and opportunity you create. I'm going to speak in a second about the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, why we think it's important, what we'd like to see delivered this year, and critically, why we think it matters to the Miami business community, and why we hope, once I've convinced you, you'll speak up and voice your support for it with your congressmen, congresswomen, and other state officials. But like any other good diplomat, it's a great opportunity. You're now a captive audience. So I just wanted to say a few words, very briefly, that what the UK has coming up over the next sort of few months before, as some of you in this room know, I actually leave. I leave after 4.5 years this summer. I'm moving to what's known as Florida North, that's Canada. And I'm going to go to work out of Toronto and be responsible for British trade investment in Canada. And in doing so, recount this, I'll just say a little story about when I first arrived in 2009. Some people gave me, you always get advice when you come to any new place on a posting. And some of the advice is, it's great here and you Brits are all loved. And some of the advice is, frankly, a little bit more straight and to the point, to say, this is a Latin city, and unlike Boston or New York, you're not really known here, you Brits, And I think there's been a journey in the 4 years matched with how this city has transformed itself and is transforming itself, pulling itself out of recession, to the state now where I say to any British minister who comes through, and we come here regularly, that this isn't a Latin city. It does have strong ties inevitably with Latin America and the Caribbean. But this is now a global city, and a rising global city, and therefore one in which Britain should engage at all levels. So, over the coming months, this is incredibly lucky for me as a British diplomat in my final 6 months. We currently have the Royal Shakespeare Company in town producing Antony and Cleopatra, set against the backdrop of the revolution in Haiti. And I urge you to go and see it, because they're also working in your community, giving lessons in Miami-Dade schools about Shakespeare. We will, in March, and some of you may know Justin Jones at the back, there'll be another Brit Week here in Miami promoting the transatlantic connections in arts, culture, science, and crucially business. And you can find out about that. Happy to speak about that later. We'll be bringing in April, just before the eMERGE Tech Conference, we're bringing about 1,200 of the world's leading experts in higher education to Miami, because we've partnered with the University of Miami, Florida International University, and Miami-Dade College to host our annual, what's called Going Global Higher Education Conference here, to help Miami sell itself as an educational hub to the globe, but also to have some real discussions about what's the benefits of higher education in the 21st century. Is a modern degree still relevant, or are there other ways of learning? And then what is both interesting for me as a Scotsman, for a variety of reasons, but absolutely wonderful for me as a British diplomat, is for 10 days, Miami will host the England football team in June as part of their pre-World Cup training here. They'll play 2 matches against Ecuador and Honduras in June. And if you thought we thought this was going to be sort of a Latin city, it's going to be very much a British city during that period. And there's a great opportunity there, we think, for helping folk here, but also in the UK, understand the benefits of Miami. And of course, I've missed out the sort of probably now the most important British personality in Miami, who is David Beckham. And while I can't get involved in politics here or otherwise. Let me just say, I don't have a vote. I very much lean very strongly towards a Major League Soccer side here in Miami as a way of showing that Miami is a great city in the US as much as it is globally. They've managed to get one in Orlando, so if you are losing out to Orlando, then that's your own debate to work through. So the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Some of you may have heard a bit about it. I'll go into it this morning. The background, the history, the impact we think it will have, and sort of what would be in a deal. And then I'm very happy to take some questions on this and questions on anything else. And there are a couple of my colleagues from the European Union, from the Netherlands and Germany I see here. There may be some others lurking around. I'm sure they'll speak up, and rightly so, if I've got anything wrong or misrepresented any positions. This was the statements from the Lochern G8 summit summer of last year, and it's really important that we see that, and that was reinforced in the President's State of the Union address last night, that there is strong political commitment in both administrations, the UK, the European Commission, and in the US, for delivering on this major trade deal. And as I said, we'll talk through getting here, the impact, and the deal. But it was quite good to go over just why is it this time a little bit different. You know, we've had lots of discussion about free trade deals in the past. Indeed, 4 years ago, the talk was more of protectionism, mercantilism, rather than free trade. So really 3 reasons here. Firstly, you know, it's one of the easiest ways easiest and least complex ways, arguably given the state of politics in some of our countries, to create jobs by lowering tariffs and trying to harmonize as much as possible. And our own economic situations, and you've lived this perhaps a little bit more than I have as a diplomat, are driving this. You know, people want jobs. They want to see the economy grow again. And when I was talking with Governor Scott about this on Friday, you know, he was very clear in his own mind that this was a good thing, and has written about this to the president politically. Second thing is, you know, as you saw from those statements earlier on, there's enthusiasm. People, you know, genuinely in politics on the UK side want to do it. It's also an opportunity within the European Union to deliver on some reform in the European Union, some much needed reform, both within the Eurozone and those countries outside the Eurozone. And thirdly, we believe it's strategically important. If you have the 2 largest global economies, the European Union and the US, reaching a deal that sets the standards and the benchmarks globally, then that's what everybody else, whether it's through the Trans-Pacific Partnership or Brazil, or potentially talk of a new world trade deal, that's the standard they will have to sort of aspire to and keep reaching. So if we can reach that strategic deal that sets the standards elsewhere, it also, for us, shows that sometimes this talk of, you know, the transatlantic relationship, but I'm not talking about the US-UK relationship, I'm talking about the transatlantic relationship between Europe and the US. People sometimes say it's no longer relevant in a multipolar world. Well, you know, we would disagree, and we would see that a free trade deal of this sort of stature would very much demonstrate that relevance. Our economies are already, as I mentioned, highly integrated. Nearly half of the world's GDP is created by this, and we have 1/3 of global trade flows. And so even bilaterally for us here in the US, you'll see that there's 250 billion annual trade between the US and the UK, and you have over 300 billion worth invested in us. And we see the opportunity to grow this more. In fact, I still think today, it's shifting just a bit, Britain owns more US debt than China. So, you know, that's given, you know, for all the talk of the rise of Asia, the importance of China, it is important. You know, more of your debt is held by the UK than China, and indeed by other countries of the European Union. And as you mentioned sort of early on, these are some of the potential benefits for the US, the EU, and the UK. And I realise that, sometimes, my eyes glaze over when you see sort of, 0.4% of GDP, is that sort of, important and stuff. For me, 125 billion is 125 billion. It's still pretty big in the grand scheme of things, and it's, a good thing to be pushing forward. So what does the structure of this, what could it look like? We see it in sort of focusing on three areas. Firstly, sort of the market access, the classic, barriers to trade, lowering tariffs that are already historically low levels, but chipping them down to even lower to enable and facilitate trade, agriculture, and industrial goods. Secondly, I think this may be of more interest to those involved in financial services and lawyers in the room, sort of regulatory issues and sort of non-tariff barriers. How can we, whether it's through intellectual property, but make sure that we have sort of common standards across the board. So perhaps there's no longer such a need to get an EU mark on something or a US mark on something, or that it's recognized that the EU mark is automatically recognized in the United States and vice versa. And that's good as well if you're outside that trading area, because you know that if you can reach a standard with the EU, it automatically reaches a standard in the US. And finally, agreeing sort of rules, principles, and new modes of cooperation. I mentioned sort of how tariffs are generally low. Some of the sectors we would be particularly interested in are financial services and legal services, but we also see, given the nature of global supply chains, opportunities in the automotive sector. For the UK is actually, I think, Europe's first or second largest car exporter at this moment in time, in large part because of global supply chains. Professional qualifications being more easily recognized across the transatlantic pitch. And also, and we would say this as free traders, an opportunity to tackle some of the sort of buy American stances here in the US. One can understand that in perhaps immediately after sort of 9/11 and the nature of the recession later on in the last decade. But now we genuinely believe, particularly at state level, and it doesn't matter so much here in Florida because state procurement is open. Florida is by and large a free trade state. But in other states, state procurement is quite closed. And we think there are opportunities here to allow European countries and companies into that market, just as we'd like to see more American companies into the European Union. So, what does this mean for Florida, and then what does this mean for Miami in particular? On your desks, and please urge you to take it away, is a joint study produced by the British Embassy, the Bertelsmann Foundation, and the Atlantic Council. And it went through each state in the Union to say what the research had done, anticipated the number of jobs to be created. We haven't given you the full sort of, big thing, partly because we can't afford to print it all off, but we've given you the summary and we've given you the Florida page, which is the very last one at the back. And as you'll see from the screen, they've estimated a TTIP would deliver an additional near 48,000 jobs for Florida. You can imagine Governor Scott's eyes light up when I put that in front of him. But in key sectors that are outside some of your traditional, well, there are some of your strengths, but outside of what some people perceive to be traditional strengths in tourism, agriculture, or the military. Aerospace, transportation, financial services, and chemicals. And I think if I pick out three of them, the sort of transportation or logistics, financial services, and aerospace, there's a so what here for Miami as Miami continues its rise and growth as a global city to how it positions itself to take advantage of TTIP. Miami-Dade or Miami International Airport is already the biggest sort of international airport in the US for logistics. 19th of May, the tunnel will finally open here, and you'll shortly complete the dredging. So you're making yourself that point where free trade really globally and transatlantically connects in here. And you have a great financial and legal services sector. You're the third largest, I think, arbitration sector in the world. So TTIP all points to sort of being good news for this community, potentially, if you grasp it and if you want to make the case for it. So how do we think we're going to get there? Well, slide I skipped over at the very beginning. You know, free trade negotiations can go on and they can go on. But the president has said, your president, that he would like to reach this on, quote, 1 tank of gas, which in practical terms, we would like to see us done within 18 to 24 months, which is quite a tall order given the history of free trade negotiations, but we don't think impossible, particularly if the president is able to secure early on trade promotion authority from this Congress, not just for this, but also for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Negotiators plan to meet every 2 months, led by the US Trade Representative on the US side, the European Commission on this side, and ultimately the final agreement negotiated by governments, Congress, and the European Parliament. It is ambitious. As diplomats, we try to be constantly focused on the optimistic end of the spectrum whilst being realistic. But we think the President's and administration's continued commitment to this, the Commission's commitment to this, can deliver something in that period, even though we may get some rocky points in other parts of the transatlantic relationship. And certainly we see it as vital if the EU is going to retain any relevance in the coming decades. And that's sort of it in summary, the final slide. Bringing 100 billion every year to the European Union and 80 billion every year to the US. My apologies that the line there doesn't sort of really go down to Florida. It sort of hangs up in New York. But, the slide wasn't done here, it was done somewhere else. So if it's done here, it goes south. But I do think there's this opportunity here for Florida and for Miami. Because even though that line goes there at the moment, which I think reflects where transatlantic trading and other relationships were, say, 20 years ago, if you think about, there was an economic center of gravity of the world, 20, 30 years ago, it's probably, and you had to put it in a map, you'd probably put it somewhere around Iceland, because that was the center between Europe and the United States. If you had to put a dot somewhere in that map now, where's the global economic center of gravity? I always say it's either somewhere just to the right of Palm Beach or somewhere out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico at the moment, because it reflects the pull from the rise of Asia to the west and the pull from the rise of South America to the south. And those clever sort of British cartographers who always manage to draw maps with Britain at the center of the world, what you now need to think about mentally, I believe, in this community, but also the rest of Florida, is that economic center of the world probably positions Florida just off that dot at that center now. And how you use your 14 ports across the state, but particularly this area here, to your benefit now, for TTIP, but also for your wider community. I'll complete there. I'm very happy to take as much detailed questions about TTIP as you're prepared to throw at me and answer, or indeed anything else on sort of the UK. And if I duck anything, I may bring in my German and Dutch colleagues at various points if they would like to add anything else. But thank you all very, very much for your time.
Questions? Okay. Has this actually been finalized, or is it still in process? You said ongoing negotiations.
So they've had two. So yeah, that's right. So it's still being negotiated. So there've been 2 meetings so far. I'm not sure when the next meeting is scheduled, but I know that on European side, quickly looking again at the website this morning, there's all sorts of consultation going on by the European Commission in Brussels and by member states with their different business communities about it. So sometimes these things take on a bit of a sort of circus element where, you know, people meet, they negotiate, they go back, go on, and so on and so forth. So it's still being negotiated at this moment in time. Josh?
Kevin, the U.S., Mexico, Canada free trade agreement has had a dramatic impact on the automotive sector in the U.S. and in Mexico. There's a lot of assembly and things in Mexico. What do you see as the benefit of TTIP to the UK specifically? Are there any specific industries that you think are well suited to serve for the creation of jobs in the UK and also for trade in the US?
Yeah. So Britain has a very diverse sort of economy with a number of strengths. I think one of the benefits for us would be a deal in the financial services sector, which makes up some 10% of Britain's GDP, and London, you know, I mean, I'd say this to a New York audience as much as a Miami audience, is the world's global financial center. There's no getting away from it. So there's a strength there, and we see sort of opportunity there, legal and other professional services. I think it increases the competition in, say, manufacturing, absolutely, and in, you know, the automotive industry. You know, there is an opportunity here, and I can imagine that my colleague in Chicago who covers Ohio and Michigan has a slightly harder sell, if I'm honest, about this for those communities there who may see this as more of a threat than an opportunity, given the history of NAFTA. Conversely to that, I would say, you know, free trade, I believe, historically has been the best way of ensuring peaceful growth between nations rather than protectionism. And Mexico's rise, for example, has been entirely beneficial to sort of the United States in terms of investment, creating sort of opportunities there. You know, there will be other sectors, honestly, that I think will be more problematic. Agriculture, which I highlighted, I think will be one. I hope it's not hijacked by a GM versus organic food agenda, but it is one, and certainly within this state, Florida, which has you know, sugar interests, that's going to be sort of difficult and challenging. France has already said separately that what's called the audiovisual sector, so that the film sector and intellectual property, they're not really so interested in that, so that's been parked to one side. But you know, if we allow ourselves to be picked off one by one, we're not going to sort of get anywhere. And the political drive is there for this. And what I'm struck, I'd be interested in your perspectives around, and I realise that some of this may be brand new to you, first of all, is in this state, you know, most congressmen, congresswomen I've spoken to on both sides of the debate are in favour. Both of your senators are in favour, your governor supports, but there's less awareness at this moment in time within business. And that's partly what I'm here to do now, to sort of hopefully get you to sort of interested and think about the opportunities for your firms as well as the community. Okay.
Hi, Kevin. David Simmons with Christie's Real Estate. I'm curious to know, have you seen any businesses, specific businesses, big ones coming into Miami in the last 6 months to a year that have been new to the market?
Cable and wireless is probably the biggest one. talking to them from the sort of British perspective. I mentioned Via Earth and Skyscanner. Yeah, others have been more done moves. So Diageo have had a long-standing presence here, sort of recently moved from out of the airport to Coral Gables. Brazilian businesses, and I take word of my Brazilian opposite number, have sort of moved in here sort of more assertively recently. But I'm very happy. As people come through, they regularly say to me, "So, can you make recommendations on who to go?" My default is, well, let's go and speak to the Beacon Council and others. I'm quite happy to share the love and just spread out their names and details as much as they want to.
Kevin, thank you very much. It's a terrible, interesting topic because it's one of those issues where it's hard for politicians to convince everybody that we're all going to benefit. And I'm staggered by those numbers that you present over here. There's another similarity, I think, between the way it's negotiated, because to a certain extent, of course, also on the U.S. side, the states have their separate interests, which they're all trying to sell in D.C. Because at the end, it's the federal government that's at the table, same as that it's the European Commission, I believe, that is doing the negotiations on that. Do you have any insights in how that process on the U.S. side is playing out? How do these states then filter in their specific needs to D.C. and what remains of all those needs once they're at the table?
So I can give you some insights from a Florida perspective. I know that the governor of Florida was a co-signatory to, with 8 other governors, to a letter to President Obama saying he supported the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and essentially, the administration, can you sort of get on and complete the negotiations? I know that within the state, the Florida Chamber of Commerce are very supportive as a business organization, and as are sort of the council here, Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce, and are making their views known. And as I've gone to, I was in Jacksonville 2 weeks ago, they've done the same thing through their chambers and making their congressmen and women aware of it. Elsewhere, I'm not so sure. I think, candidly, in an election year, I think sort of most congressmen and women at this moment in time are in a sort of electoral mode, fundraising, talking to their communities, and this is just over the horizon for them. It sounds good, makes sense, who wouldn't want to agree with that? But then they'll get into the detail, and it's at that point, we as the European Union and the UK need to be able to have honest conversations about what we think it means for this sector here and that sector there. But again, we don't really know that at the moment. It's a bit like trying to build the aircraft whilst you're flying it. We know where we want to go, we know we've got a bolt on a wing here and things, and we're going to get there and it's going to be fine in the end. But some of this will get teased out as we go along. We've done our own, you see from the report, quite a lot of research because, historically, for good reasons, Britain has been a free trading nation like Netherlands, and we also think it's a great way for us to be able to sell the EU in Britain as being relevant. And some of you may know the history of the debates about the European Union and Britain, but if the EU can negotiate something on a global scale like this, that helps further sort of a ambitious agenda by Britain to sort of increase its exports globally and inward investment into the UK, then that's a great thing and helps deal with another debate we have.
Thank you.
Maybe over here.
You mentioned some of the issues with states and elections coming up. Any elections in Europe that in the next 2 to 3 years that might have an effect on negotiating? I know England is going through a process the next couple of years. Others that might have an effect on how far to push this?
Okay, so elections. My own government has an election in 18 months' time in Britain, and clearly that's at the back of my sort of minister's times. I'm not sure about Netherlands or Germany. They're government and they form coalitions, or they're about to form sort of coalitions. We also, in the UK, have a referendum on Scottish independence that I don't see affecting this so much. I think if, it's more if there are transatlantic wobbles and other things. So some of the stuff, candidly around Edward Snowden, bubbles up, and can we continue negotiating in good faith, and so on and so forth. And sort of my answer is yes, we can, because we shouldn't. Those discussions around security are separate from this. That it's not to say they're not to be addressed, and there's not some seriousness there, but don't let that get in the way of something as big as this. I'm not sure the electoral pattern. Well, sorry, there is one other one. I do apologise. There are elections to the European Parliament in April-May this year. That will produce a new Parliament, and that European Parliament will have a say in the agreement, sort of at the end. So we'll see the makeup then at that stage. Okay.
Do you think that the British companies, European companies in general, do perceive Miami as a gateway to Latin America? And I'm trying to get a sense of the kind of impact that this agreement could have to the region.
I think they do. Certainly those I've spoken to. There are, and then you guys want to speak out. For the UK, we have about 330 British affiliated companies in the state of Florida. 80 of them are based around South Florida because of the vibrancy of the economy here and the importance to Florida. Many of them are here for regional business. Cable and Wireless I mentioned sort of earlier on. Diageo, the Latin American Caribbean headquarters. Inmarsat, they're America's headquarters. And then there are a number of Anglo-American law firms here who it's a jumping off point to go into sort of South America, do business, or host the meetings up here. So they do see it. There's if you remember the Olympics and the little mascots we had with the Olympics, they were done by an advertising firm called Iris International. Their Latin American headquarters, they work with Sony across the region. They were helped to be set up by the Beacon Council here in Miami. So there is a narrative there. I think that the challenge I sort of see is sort of, explaining to them that it's a hub place where you can gather sort of people in, but you still have to travel. In order to be relevant in South America, you've got to have knowledge of the ground. You can't do it sort of remotely over the horizon. That's do you agree with that?
Oh, yes, totally. And we're trying, as the Dutch concept, more or less trying to capitalize on that gateway function as well, which is kind of difficult because we haven't quite figured out how to approach that issue. But it's certainly so that, and I think the Beacon Council can attest to that we a lot of the companies that I think contact you to set up headquarters or just affiliates here in South Florida do that because they definitely see the link with the South. And I agree entirely that traveling and being on the ground and that is of course very important, and that is no place in the world I think it's so easy to travel to South America than from Miami. If you just look at the staggering amount of flights that fly back and forth to Brazil every day. It's ridiculous. But there are also a lot of financial streams, I think, and that is very important. So you can actually conduct your business from here and travel to South America and then pay the bills here. So it's definitely, and I think there's more opportunities here in South Florida to grow in that respect because of
the two very different cities, Miami and Panama. But when I first arrived 4 years ago, lots of people would say to me, Panama's the new Miami. That's where we've got to go to cover Central and South America. I think 4 years later, the sense of, yes, it's something different in Panama, but it's not Miami. And actually, as you know, if you look outside the door there, the construction, the development, the plans for this city through 2020 sort of reassert sort of Miami's regional sort of prominence in a way. Now, I'm not going to get involved in a beauty contest. People have to make their decisions where they make their investment. But I think this whether it's been delivered or otherwise, I think, you know, the nature of the economy turning, plus individuals in Miami saying, well, if people are thinking Panama's the new Miami, hang on, you know, we've got to show them that's not the case. And I think that's what's different now than when I first arrived 4 years ago. No one wants to meet David Beckham. Great, that's why I get asked. No, bring it up.
I won't say no.
No, okay, great. Well, look, you know, I don't want to cut things off. I could go on for days, but you know, we will have England here for 10 days or so, which will be fantastic. They're a bit nervous at times, so thank you all for coming out again this morning. Weather's lifting now, so we're all dry, and it's, you know, Sheldon, you know, you've run a great organisation. You've got a great set of members here in you know, really, truly great and global city. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Mr. Consul General, we are going to miss you, but I know you won't be a stranger to us in Miami. I'd like to thank everyone for coming. This has been an excellent discussion, and we'll see you again soon. One little commercial, please put in your calendars the Beacon Awards scheduled for April 6th. You'll be hearing more about that. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Have a great day.